What's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk about rent control. Just recently, Bernie Sanders put out a tweet that maybe one of his policies would be nationwide rent control. And if you're not familiar, rent control is basically when a landlord has a building, they have limitations on lease turnovers, lease renewals, most importantly, price increases on your rent from year to year, because a lot of people, they do 1-year leases. You're not having these long commercial leases. But the question is today, rent control, is it good? Is it bad? And one thing which is kind of in my mind is it constitutional? So this year, California, they passed a statewide rent control. It's the second of its kind. Washington, I'm going to pull it up here. Washington also did it as well. But basically this year in California, they voted to have a statewide rent control, rent caps. There's a little bit of a difference between rent control, rent stabilization, rent caps, things like this. But for the purpose of this video and this podcast, we're just going to talk about the concept of the government regulating your property as a landlord. So this year in California, it's going to cap all rent increases to 5%. And they also changed some of the renewals of just cause and how to get, just wanting to let someone go because you want to renew the lease. Now, obviously, if you can't pay the rent, that's something totally different. But a lot of times, landlords might just want to get you out, and they don't really have to have a reason. So the question is, what would nationwide rent control look like? I think, a lot of times when we talk about, in this podcast, we talk about the balance between the government, private industry, housing, and how it intersects with culture and how it all comes together. I think that nationwide rent control would be a terrible idea. Housing is one of these things that it's not a perfect market because it takes a long time to transact. There's a lot of personal factors involved with it. People have held assets for a long time, where it's also that they, at different prices in different areas, they live in these things. It's not like a stock where you just you can buy and hold and trade and things like that. But I think that, it's great to have rent control and rent stabilization. It's good for a community and persons and a city to have stable housing. But you also have to think about it from the flip side as well. Is it constitutional? Is it okay for the government to come in and say, hey, you are not allowed to do what you want to do with your property? I mean, as Americans, and it's one of in our Constitution to have the right, liberty to freedom and property. But when the government comes in and tells you what you can and cannot do with your property, is that constitutional? Should that be allowed? We have things like eminent domain, which are also controversial when we want to build infrastructure projects. But for rent control, it's really about your rights as an owner versus rights as a tenant of someone who's leased to you. Recently in New York, I think it was in July 2019, because of the laws we've talked about before for the change in our state, landlords went and tried to press that these rent stabilization laws were unconstitutional. And even things with SROs, which are single room occupancies, are not quite full apartments, but basically not allowing landlords to sell or demolish buildings as they chose if these tenants had protections. As you have known before, in some cities, if you have rent protection or rent stabilization, even if an owner wants to sell, you don't have to leave for the new owner, technically. And even if they wanted to demolish the building, it'd be very hard to get you out if you don't want to leave. The building would have to be in really poor shape or a hazard to the public, right? So Bernie Sanders is calling for national rent control. I think that you have to have some of these protections in place, but it's just really, it treads on the line of being unconstitutional. And is it good for business? Like sometimes, say for instance in California, 5%. Does that mean, what if what if the year before you rented it to someone under certain circumstances, maybe their job, or maybe there was a death in the family, or the income changed, and then you're stuck in that 5%. Like 5% of 1,000 or 5% of 5,000 is a huge difference, because as the numbers go up, it changes a little bit. So it's been done in Washington, it's been done in California, and now a presidential candidate is calling for this. What do you think? Do you think that nationwide rent control is good? Is it bad? Is it unconstitutional? Like, should the government have that much power to let you control their assets? And then once they're in, there was reports this year that the building sales have gone down quite substantially because of this new law in New York, and that negatively impacts them. So where does the balance come in? Because I think we're also in a crux in our culture right now where people are talking. We're trying to think about, especially with the president. We have a president there now who's really into deregulating, cutting down government, small government, and then we have on the polar opposite, huge government, talking about socialism, nationalized healthcare, things like that. So I'm going to see how this pans out. In California right now, this is about to go into effect because it's 2019. Let's see where the ramifications come for that. I know one big thing also about cities like LA, everything's 1, 2, 3, 5 stories. It's not very big. You're not allowed to build very high. Would that help? Would you allowing certain places to increase zoning, make it easier to build? That's also in California. There's a lot of community voting that shuts down development. We have that in New York as well, but not to the same extent. But we'll see. Let's see how this pans out. I don't think it's really possible to have a federal rent stabilization or rent regulation like that. But let's see. Are you going to be allowed to sell your property? Is it devaluing your property? What's going to happen to the loans behind those properties if it affects the sales and income on those properties? Because you also forget that huge portions of these buildings are on debt. So they're also servicing interest and debt loans. Cost of interest goes up. You have inflation. That was another thing I was going to say. It does have markers in it to account for inflation for the landlord. Also, you also forget that you can be paying a very high rent and be a high net worth individual and have a rent stabilized apartment. So basically, if you go into Midtown right now, there's a lot of buildings that got rent stabilization laws, but their cap is very high. So it could be $3,000, $5,000 a month. Do they need it? Do they deserve it? Or is it someone who's paying $1,000? Like the price point matters. And there's another one too. You can also get abuses in it as well. So sometimes you go to some places, and because of the circumstances of the timing, when they got it, the situation they were in. I've seen people outside of government regulated housing in Beamers, and they're not doing anything illegal. They just pay $500 a month for their rent, and there's 6 people there who all work. So where does that fine line happen? And then also, is this going to encourage stagnation in the market? So if you had these protections, people aren't going to move, because once you move, you lose the protections. But if you stay, then it's locked in. So it's been upheld in New York that it's still ongoing, but it's not been totally dismantled. Obviously, you have a lot of lobbying efforts between landlord advocacy groups, tenant organizers, but it's an interesting argument. And then also, I'm going to finish up as well as that. Do you think that certain, maybe like the prices in New York or the housing situation in New York might be affected by this because we have large swaths of like Queens or certain areas that at that time have these rent protections? And is that putting pressure on the market rate apartments and that's why everything's high? Or if there was more fluidity of people moving, making quality houses, more competition to bring prices down, allow people to build more, would that make it easier for everybody to move and have more fluidity in the market so that people can that prices wouldn't skyrocket in market rate and be something else for regulated? So hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you do, like, subscribe on iTunes and YouTube. Find me on Instagram, on all social media at Marcus Amadeus. And just for some business stuff, if you're looking for a home to buy, sell, or rent in New York City, or you just want some advice, contact me. I'm a real estate agent. I've been for over a decade. We also have design, construction, attorneys you can talk to, mortgage bankers to shop with, movers, appraisals, handyman, one-stop shop. We can help you out and make sure that they're vetted, make sure that they are quality, and you're not just finding someone random that is not going to do a good job. And also with our nationwide network, if you're moving out of town, we can help you in your new city. If you're moving into town, you can help as well. We have a network all over the country. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks for tuning in. See you later. Bye.